When we ask the question of how Islam reached Australia, many people instinctively assume that it must have arrived only after European settlement, carried by migrants in the modern era. But history, when examined carefully, tells a far richer and far more fascinating story. In fact, Islam reached the shores of Australia centuries before the British flag was ever planted on this land, and it did so not through armies, not through forced conversions, but through something far more powerful and far more enduring: human interaction, trade, and trust. Long before Captain Cook charted these waters, the northern coastline of Australia was already known to Muslim sailors from Southeast Asia, particularly from Macassan in what is now Indonesia. These were skilled seafarers who had mastered the monsoon winds, navigating vast distances across the Indian Ocean with remarkable precision. For them, Australia was not an unknown or mysterious land. It was a familiar destination, visited regularly and deliberately. Historical and archaeological evidence shows that as early as the 16th century, and possibly even earlier, these Muslim traders were making seasonal journeys to the northern shores of Australia. Their primary purpose was trade. They came in search of trepang, or sea cucumber, a highly valued commodity in Chinese markets. But trade, as we know, is never just about goods. Wherever people trade, ideas travel with them, languages mix, customs are observed, beliefs are encountered, and this is precisely how Islam began to make its quiet but meaningful presence felt in Australia. What is especially significant is the nature of these interactions. The Macassan Muslims did not arrive as conquerors. They did not attempt to dominate or displace the indigenous peoples of the land. Instead, they formed cooperative relationships with Aboriginal communities, particularly in Arnhem Land. They returned year after year, sometimes staying for months at a time, living alongside local populations, working together, and developing mutual respect. This alone challenges many modern assumptions about how religions spread and how civilizations interact. Through these repeated encounters, Aboriginal communities were exposed to aspects of Islamic culture and practice. Words from the Macassan language entered local Aboriginal languages. Some Aboriginal rock art appears to depict Macassan boats, and there are oral histories passed down through generations that speak of these visitors from the north. Even certain practices, such as concepts of cleanliness, structured daily routines, and spiritual awareness, may have been subtly influenced through this contact. Now, it is important to be clear, this was not mass conversion, nor was it organized missionary activity. Islam did not arrive with a grand announcement or an official declaration. Instead, it arrived the way Islam so often has throughout history, through character, through consistency, and through conduct. The Macassan Muslims lived their faith openly but naturally. Their prayers, their ethics, their honesty in trade, and their discipline were all visible expressions of Islam in action. And sometimes that speaks louder than words ever could. This early contact also forces us to rethink Australia's place in global history. Australia was not isolated from the rest of the world until Europeans discovered it. It was already connected to vast trade networks stretching across Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. Islam, as a global civilization, was already part of this interconnected world, and Australia was not excluded from that story. There is something deeply profound about this. Islam's first footsteps on Australian soil were gentle. They left no scars of violence, no records of coercion, no legacy of domination. Instead, they left traces of interaction, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. In an age where Islam is often discussed in the language of conflict, this historical reality offers a powerful corrective. It reminds us that Islam's relationship with Australia began not in tension, but in trust. And perhaps the most striking aspect of all is how early this occurred. Centuries before modern nation states, before immigration policies, before debates about identity and belonging, Muslims were already engaging with this land. Islam's presence in Australia is not a recent experiment. It is an old chapter that has only recently been rediscovered and appreciated. This early maritime contact sets the foundation for everything that follows in the story of Islam in Australia. It explains why later developments such as the arrival of Muslim cameleers, the building of mosques, and the growth of Muslim communities were not anomalies but continuations of an already established connection. Islam did not suddenly appear in Australia. It gradually unfolded, layer by layer, over centuries. And so, when we speak of how Islam reached Australia, we begin not with ships from Europe, but with sails from the north, guided by the winds, carrying traders whose faith traveled with them, not as a weapon, but as a way of life. Now, once we understand that Muslims were already reaching the northern shores of Australia through these early maritime journeys, the next question naturally follows. What actually happened when they arrived? Were these brief, distant encounters? Or did they leave a real imprint on the people and the land? And it is here that the story becomes even more compelling, because the relationship between the Macassan Muslims and Aboriginal communities was not shallow or incidental. It was sustained, meaningful, and transformative in quiet but lasting ways. For generations, Macassan sailors traveled seasonally to northern Australia, particularly Arnhem Land. They did not come once and disappear. They returned year after year, following the rhythms of the monsoon winds. Over time, familiarity replaced foreignness, trust replaced suspicion, and cooperation replaced isolation. Aboriginal communities knew when the Macassans would arrive and prepared for their presence, and the Macassans in turn relied on local knowledge to navigate the land, access resources, and survive. In unfamiliar terrain, trade was at the heart of this relationship, but it quickly grew into something much deeper. The Macassans came primarily to harvest trepang, but they did not work alone. Aboriginal people actively participated in the process, collecting, processing, and preparing the trepang for export. In exchange, they received tools, cloth, metal goods, and other items that were previously unknown to them. This exchange reshaped daily life, technology, and even social structures in some communities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this connection is the cultural exchange that took place alongside the economic one. Language is often the clearest marker of long-term contact, and here the evidence is undeniable. Words of Macassan origin entered Aboriginal languages, particularly those related to trade, boats, tools, and social interaction. This is not something that happens from a single meeting. It only occurs when people interact consistently over long periods of time. Beyond language, there are traces of Macassan influence preserved in Aboriginal art and oral tradition. Rock paintings in northern Australia depict boats with distinctive triangular sails, images that closely resemble Macassan vessels. Oral histories speak of visitors from the north, describing their appearance, their customs, and their seasonal arrivals. These stories were passed down long before written records existed, preserving a memory of Muslim contact that survived colonization itself. And then there is the spiritual dimension of this exchange. Again, we must be careful not to exaggerate or romanticize. This was not widespread conversion, nor was it formal religious instruction, but exposure matters. Seeing Muslim sailors pause their work to pray, observing their dietary practices, their emphasis on cleanliness, their sense of time structured around daily worship, these things leave impressions. Faith was not preached aggressively, it was lived visibly, and sometimes the quiet consistency of lived faith plants deeper seeds than loud proclamation. What makes this interaction particularly significant is its tone. There is no evidence of violence, coercion, or exploitation in these relationships. The Macassans did not claim land. They did not attempt to govern Aboriginal communities. They came, they traded, they interacted, and they left, returning again the following season. This stands in stark contrast to what would later occur with European colonization, making the Macassan Aboriginal relationship all the more striking. In many ways, this interaction represents one of the earliest examples of sustained cross-cultural engagement in Australian history. It shows us that Aboriginal communities were not isolated from the wider world, and that they were active participants in international networks of trade and exchange. Islam entered this context not as an alien force, but as part of a broader human encounter that respected existing cultures. This also challenges another modern misconception, that Islam and indigenous cultures are somehow inherently incompatible. History shows us the opposite. The earliest meeting between Islam and the peoples of Australia occurred without erasure, without domination, and without cultural annihilation. It occurred with mutual benefit and relative harmony. That alone is a lesson worth reflecting upon. As European settlement later disrupted both Aboriginal life and these long-standing connections, the Macassan presence eventually faded. But the traces they left behind did not disappear. They remained embedded in language, art, memory, and history. And today, as scholars and communities revisit this past, there is a growing recognition that Islam's roots in Australia are deeper and more nuanced than many had previously imagined. This Macassan Aboriginal connection forms a crucial bridge in the story of Islam in Australia. It links the earliest maritime contact to the later arrival of Muslim communities under colonial rule. It shows continuity rather than coincidence. Islam did not arrive suddenly or accidentally. It arrived through relationships, through repeated encounters, and through shared human experience. And when we reflect on this chapter of history, we are reminded that some of the strongest foundations are built not with force or fanfare, but with patience, respect, and the quiet power of coexistence. As history moves forward, the story of Islam in Australia does not pause with early maritime contact. Instead, it takes on a new and very visible form in the 19th century, during a time when Australia itself was still being shaped and understood. The vast interior of this land was largely unknown to European settlers. Harsh deserts, extreme climates, and distances that horses and wagons simply could not manage. And it is precisely here, in one of the most difficult chapters of Australia's development, that Muslims once again quietly but decisively enter the story. The British colonial authorities faced a serious problem. They wanted to explore the interior, build roads, establish trade routes, and connect distant settlements, but they lacked the means to do so. Camels, however, were perfectly suited to this environment. They could travel long distances without water, endure intense heat, and carry heavy loads across unforgiving terrain. The problem was not the camels themselves. It was finding people who actually knew how to work with them. And so the solution came from the Muslim world. From the mid-1008s onward, Muslim cameleers were brought to Australia from regions such as Afghanistan, British India, Balochistan, and parts of the Middle East. Although they were collectively referred to as Afghans, many came from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds, united primarily by their shared faith and expertise. These men were not explorers seeking fame, nor settlers chasing wealth. They were skilled workers, brought in because no one else could do what they could. Their contribution to Australia cannot be overstated. Muslim cameleers played a central role in opening up the Australian interior. They transported supplies to remote settlements, assisted major expeditions, helped construct telegraph lines, and enabled trade routes that would otherwise have been impossible. Some of the most significant exploratory journeys in Australian history depended entirely on their knowledge and resilience. Quite literally, modern Australia was carried on the backs of camels guided by Muslim hands. And yet, despite their indispensable role, these men lived on the margins of society. They were often excluded, isolated, and subjected to racism and suspicion. They were essential, but rarely welcomed. Many were not allowed to bring their families. They lived in makeshift camps on the outskirts of towns, forming tight-knit communities bound by faith and shared hardship. And it is here that we see something deeply powerful about their story. Even in isolation, even in hardship, they held firmly to their faith. Islam was not something they left behind at the docks. It was something they carried with them into the desert. They prayed in the open land, they fasted under the scorching sun, they organized their lives around their religious obligations, even when there were no mosques, no institutions, and no wider community to support them. Eventually, they began to build places of worship, simple structures made not of grandeur, but of necessity and devotion. These were among the earliest mosques in Australia. They stood as quiet testimonies to perseverance, spiritual discipline, and belonging. For these men, Islam was not just a private belief. It was a source of identity, dignity, and strength in a society that often denied them all three. What is remarkable is that their presence normalized Islam in Australia long before large-scale Muslim migration. Australians living in remote regions became accustomed to seeing Muslim men, hearing the call to prayer in distant camps, and relying on them for survival and progress. Islam was not an abstract concept. It was embodied in men who delivered food, water, mail, and hope across impossible distances. And yet, history did not reward them fairly. As railways expanded and camels were no longer needed, the cameleers were pushed aside. Many returned home. Others remained, aging quietly in a land they had helped build, but would never fully claim them as their own. Their stories were rarely written into textbooks. Their names faded, even as their legacy remained embedded in the infrastructure of the nation. But if we pause and reflect, something becomes very clear. Islam's presence in Australia was not confined to ports or coastal trade. It moved inland, it crossed deserts. It stood at the very heart of exploration and development. It was there when roads were forged, when communication lines were laid, and when the vast emptiness of the interior was first connected to the rest of the world. This chapter of history challenges another misconception, that Muslims are newcomers to Australia's story. The cameleers were not outsiders looking in, they were foundational contributors. They helped transform Australia from a collection of isolated colonies into a connected continent. And they did so while holding on to their faith with quiet determination. When we speak of Islam reaching Australia, this is not a side note. This is a central chapter. Islam arrived not just with trade, but with labor, not just with interaction, but with sacrifice. And it helped shape the physical and social landscape of the nation in ways that still echo today. They crossed the desert carrying more than supplies. They carried faith, endurance, and a legacy that Australia still stands upon. As these Muslim cameleers settled into the harsh realities of life in Australia, something very important began to happen. Islam, which had so far been carried quietly through trade routes, deserts, and temporary camps, began to take on a more permanent and visible form. Faith that had once been practiced in open land or makeshift spaces now sought roots, and those roots took shape in the form of Australia's first mosques. To understand the significance of this moment, we need to appreciate what a mosque represents. A mosque is not merely a building, it is a declaration of belonging. It says, "We are here to stay." For Muslim communities living on the margins of society, often facing exclusion and hostility, the decision to build a mosque was an act of courage. It was a spiritual statement in a land where they were often treated as temporary guests, even though they had helped build the nation itself. The earliest mosques in Australia were not grand structures. They were simple, humble, and functional, built from stone, corrugated iron, or mud brick. But their simplicity should not fool us. These mosques carried immense symbolic weight. They marked the transition of Islam in Australia from a transient presence to an organized, enduring one. One of the most notable examples is the Adelaide Mosque, completed in 1888. This was not built by wealthy patrons or supported by state institutions. It was funded and maintained by Muslim Cameleers, men who lived modest lives, worked exhausting jobs, and faced constant discrimination. Yet they prioritized their faith. They pooled their limited resources to establish a place where they could pray together, teach their children, and maintain their religious identity in an unfamiliar land. Think about what that means. In a society that often pushed them to the outskirts, these Muslims carved out sacred space at the center of their lives. The mosque became more than a prayer hall. It became a community anchor. It was a place of brotherhood, learning, dispute resolution, and emotional support. It gave structure to lives that were otherwise unstable and uncertain. And this was not limited to Adelaide. Other mosques emerged in places like Marrie, Broken Hill, and Perth, often near camel depots or railway lines. Their locations tell a story. Islam in Australia was not confined to one city or one class of people. It followed the rhythms of labor, infrastructure, and survival. Wherever Muslims settled, even temporarily, they sought to establish spaces of worship. What is striking is how early this institutional presence appeared. These mosques were built decades before Australia embraced multiculturalism. Decades before Muslims were considered a recognized religious community. Islam did not wait for permission to belong. It belonged because Muslims were already there working, contributing, and living their faith openly. These early mosques also served as points of interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims. Curious locals would visit. Conversations would happen. Misunderstandings would be challenged. Islam was no longer an abstract identity associated with foreign lands. It had a physical address. It had walls, doors, and a community behind them. Yet, despite their importance, many of these mosques were neglected in historical narratives. Some fell into disrepair. Others were demolished as communities dwindled and populations shifted. But even when the buildings disappeared, their legacy did not. They had already done something irreversible. They had normalized Islam as part of the Australian religious landscape. And this is where we must pause and reflect on something deeper. These mosques were built by people who knew they might never be fully accepted. Many of the Cameleers were denied citizenship. Some were prohibited from bringing families. Others lived and died in a land that benefited from their labor, but withheld full belonging. And yet they invested in institutions not just for themselves, but for generations they might never meet. That tells us something profound about their vision. They were not merely surviving, they were planting seeds. They believed that Islam had a future in Australia, even if they themselves would not live to see it fully realized. Their mosques were acts of hope, and that hope was not misplaced. These early mosques laid the groundwork for everything that came later. When post-war Muslim migrants arrived, they did not enter a spiritual vacuum. They found traces of a legacy already present: mosques, burial grounds, stories, and historical continuity. Islam in Australia had a past, and that past gave legitimacy to its future. So when we speak about the establishment of Australia's first mosques, we are not talking about architecture. We are talking about identity. We are talking about resilience. We are talking about faith that refused to be erased, even when circumstances were harsh and recognition was scarce. These mosques stood quietly, but they spoke loudly. They said that Islam was no longer passing through Australia. It had arrived, it had settled, and it had put down roots. As we move into the 20th century, the story of Islam in Australia enters a new phase, one that is broader, more visible, and far more diverse. Up until this point, Muslim presence had been shaped by traders, cameleers, and small, often isolated communities. But after the Second World War, something changed. Australia itself began to change, and with that change came a transformation in who was allowed to belong. For much of its early history, Australia's immigration policies were restrictive and exclusionary. They favored a narrow vision of identity and left little room for religious or cultural diversity. But after the devastation of World War II, the country faced a pressing need for population growth and labor. Slowly, policies began to shift. Doors that had once been firmly closed began cautiously to open. And through those openings came a new wave of Muslims' families, not just workers, communities, not just individuals. One of the most significant arrivals during this period came from Turkey. In the 1960s and 1970s, agreements between Australia and Turkey allowed Turkish Muslims to migrate as part of labor programs. Many arrived with the intention of working temporarily and returning home. But plans changed. Children were born. Roots were laid down. Temporary stays became permanent lives. What followed was the formation of some of Australia's first large, stable Muslim communities. Not long after, Muslims from Lebanon began arriving, followed by those from Bosnia, South Asia, and later parts of Africa. Each group came with its own language, culture, and historical experiences, but they were united by faith and by the shared challenge of building new lives in an unfamiliar land. Islam in Australia was no longer associated with one ethnicity or one profession. It was becoming unmistakably global. This period marked a turning point. Mosques were no longer just small prayer spaces tucked away near camel depots or industrial zones. Purpose-built mosques began to appear in suburbs and cities. Islamic schools were established, community organizations formed, halal businesses grew. Islam began to be woven into the everyday social fabric of Australian life. But this growth did not come without struggle. Many Muslim migrants faced cultural shock, economic hardship, and discrimination. They had to navigate a society that often misunderstood their faith and questioned their belonging. And yet, much like the Muslims who came before them, they responded not by retreating, but by building. They invested in education, they emphasized family, they worked tirelessly to balance faith with civic participation. What is remarkable is how quickly these communities adapted, while still preserving their religious identity. Islam was not frozen in time, it was lived dynamically. Mosques became spaces not only of worship, but of youth engagement, interfaith dialogue, and social support. Muslim Australians learned to speak in multiple cultural languages at once, faithfully Muslim, confidently Australian. This era also marked the first time Islam entered public awareness in a sustained way. Muslims were no longer invisible contributors in remote regions. They were neighbors, co-workers, classmates. Islam became something Australians encountered not through distant headlines, but through everyday relationships. And that proximity mattered. It humanized what had once been abstract. At the same time, global events increasingly shaped local perceptions. Conflicts abroad, political upheavals, and media narratives sometimes cast long shadows over Muslim communities at home. And yet, despite these pressures, Australian Muslims continued to grow, not just in number, but in confidence and contribution. By the late 20th century, Islam was firmly established as one of Australia's major religions. Muslim doctors, teachers, engineers, business owners, and public servants became part of the national story. The children of migrants grew up speaking with Australian accents, navigating multiple identities with ease, and asking deeper questions about faith, justice, and belonging. This post-war migration period did something essential. It connected Islam's early, often overlooked history in Australia with its present reality. It transformed Islam from a quiet presence into a recognized community, but it did so without erasing the past. The legacy of traders, cameleers, and early mosques did not disappear. It found new life through new generations. And perhaps this is the most important point of all. Islam did not arrive in Australia once. It arrived again and again, each time adapting to new circumstances, each time putting down deeper roots. The post-war migrants were not starting from nothing. They were continuing a story that had already been unfolding for centuries. They carried Islam not as something foreign to this land, but as something that had already proven it could belong. And this brings us to the present moment, where all of these earlier chapters converge into the reality of Islam in modern Australia. When we look around today, it becomes clear that Islam is no longer something distant, historical, or marginal. It is lived, visible, and woven into the everyday fabric of the nation. What began with sailors on the northern coast, with cameleers in the desert, with modest mosques built against the odds, has now matured into a confident, multifaceted community that calls Australia home without hesitation. Today, Muslims in Australia come from every corner of the globe. They are Arab and Turkish, South Asian and African, Southeast Asian and European. And increasingly, they are also indigenous and Anglo-Australian people whose connection to Islam does not pass through migration at all. This diversity is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a long history of interaction, settlement, and growth. Islam in Australia cannot be reduced to a single culture, language, or story, because it has always existed at the crossroads of many. You see this diversity reflected in everyday life. Muslims are doctors treating patients in hospitals, teachers shaping young minds in classrooms, engineers designing infrastructure, entrepreneurs running small businesses, and volunteers serving their local communities. They are present in sports, arts, media, academia, and public service. In other words, Muslims are not living alongside Australian society, they are part of it. Mosques today are no longer hidden or makeshift. They stand openly in cities and suburbs, serving not only as places of worship, but as centers for education, charity, counseling, and community engagement. Islamic schools educate tens of thousands of students. Youth organizations help young Muslims navigate questions of identity, faith, and belonging. Interfaith initiatives bring people together across religious lines, continuing a tradition of dialogue that stretches back to those earliest encounters on Australia's northern shores. And yet, modernity brings its own challenges. Australian Muslims live in a world shaped by global events, media narratives, and political tensions that often have little to do with their actual lives. There are moments of misunderstanding, fear, and suspicion. There are times when Muslims are asked to explain themselves, to justify their faith, or to prove their loyalty. These pressures are real, and they should not be minimized. But what is striking is how resilient the community has been in the face of these challenges. Rather than retreating inward, many Muslims have chosen to engage outward, to speak, to educate, to build bridges. They have insisted that their faith is not a barrier to citizenship, but a source of ethical grounding, compassion, and social responsibility. In doing so, they have echoed the patterns set by earlier generations, respond to difficulty not with withdrawal, but with contribution. Perhaps one of the most defining features of Islam in modern Australia is the emergence of a distinctly Australian Muslim identity. This is a generation that is comfortable being both deeply rooted in faith and fully at home in Australian culture. They speak the language fluently, literally, and socially. They understand the values of fairness, mateship, and community, and they are asking important questions about what it means to live faithfully, ethically, and confidently in a pluralistic society. This is not the Islam of isolation. This is the Islam of engagement. It is an Islam that sees no contradiction between praying in a mosque and serving the wider community, between religious commitment and civic responsibility. In many ways, it is a continuation of everything that came before: trade without coercion, labor with integrity, worship with resilience, and community built through patience. When we step back and look at the entire journey, something becomes unmistakably clear. Islam did not arrive in Australia as an interruption to its story. It arrived as part of it. It grew alongside the nation, sometimes quietly, sometimes visibly, but always persistently. From the coast to the desert, from small prayer spaces to thriving communities, Islam has been present not just in Australia, but with Australia. And this historical awareness matters because it reframes the conversation. It reminds us that Muslims are not outsiders asking for space. They are contributors standing on centuries of connection. Islam in Australia is not a recent arrival still finding its footing. It is a long-standing presence still unfolding its potential. So when we ask how Islam reached Australia, the answer is not found in a single moment or a single group. It is found in a journey, one marked by trade, trust, sacrifice, faith, and perseverance. And that journey has led us here, to a moment where Islam is no longer just part of Australia's past, but an integral part of its present and its future. Islam did not merely reach Australia. It took root, it grew, and it belongs.